The courtroom fell silent as all eyes fixed on the single mother sitting at the defendant's table. Across the room, the lawyer smirked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Your Honor, I'm not sure why we're even entertaining this nonsense," he said, flipping through his polished leather briefcase. "Clearly, Ms. Taylor lacks the education, resources, and, if I may, basic understanding of the law to defend herself here today." A few muffled chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The lawyer adjusted his tie, glancing smugly toward the jury as if to say, "This is too easy." Then came her voice, calm, confident, and cutting through the tension like a knife. "Objection, Your Honor." The judge raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds, Ms. Taylor?" "On the grounds that Mr. Hargrove just made my case for me," she said, standing. Her gaze locked on the lawyer, and for the first time, his smirk faltered. A few jurors leaned forward. Even the judge looked intrigued. "You think I lack resources, Mr. Hargrove? Funny you should mention that, because the resources I've collected over the past 2 months include proof that your client forged evidence, manipulated contracts, and violated federal law in ways I'm sure the IRS would love to hear about." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, and whispers filled the air as the lawyer's smug demeanor dissolved into shock. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The judge banged the gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" Ms. Taylor leaned forward, her voice steady but lethal. "And that's just the beginning, Mr. Hargrove. Shall I continue?" 2 months earlier, the weight of the world had rested squarely on Rebecca Taylor's shoulders. Raising her 6-year-old daughter, Lily, alone was no small feat. The rent was overdue, and the refrigerator was emptier than she cared to admit. She'd been working double shifts at a diner in downtown Boston when she got the letter. At first, she thought it was a mistake, a legal notice from the owner of the apartment complex where she lived. They were suing her for damages she hadn't caused, claiming she owed thousands of dollars she didn't have. Rebecca tried calling the landlord, but her requests for clarification were ignored. When she showed up at the management office, the receptionist handed her a business card with the name James Hargrove, attorney at law. Rebecca's heart sank. Hargrove wasn't just any lawyer. He was one of the most cutthroat litigators in the state, known for his flashy suits, expensive cars, and zero tolerance for losing cases. "What's a single mom like me supposed to do against someone like that?" she muttered to herself that night, staring at the letter. The answer came to her the next morning, when Lily ran into the kitchen, holding a crayon drawing of Rebecca standing in front of a giant trophy. "What's this, sweetie?" Rebecca asked, smiling despite herself. "It's you, Mommy. You're the best. You can win anything." Rebecca hugged her daughter tightly, tears stinging her eyes. "Anything, huh?" she whispered. That was the moment Rebecca decided she wasn't going to roll over and let the system crush her. She didn't have money for a lawyer, but she had something even more important: determination. Over the next few weeks, Rebecca spent every free moment she had in the public library, poring over books on property law, contract disputes, and civil litigation. The librarians, initially skeptical of her determination, soon became her biggest supporters. "You're really doing this, huh?" one of them asked as Rebecca signed out another stack of books. "I have to," Rebecca replied. For Lily, her first breakthrough came late one night when she discovered a glaring inconsistency in the landlord's claim. According to their records, the supposed damages occurred 6 months before she'd even moved into the apartment. Armed with this information, Rebecca filed a motion to delay the trial. She used the extra time to dig deeper, discovering more and more cracks in the landlord's story. She even found evidence suggesting that some of the repairs they claimed she owed money for hadn't been completed at all. By the time the court date arrived, Rebecca had built a case so solid it was like a fortress. But Hargrove wasn't worried. When the trial began, he strode into the courtroom with the confidence of a man who'd already won. He didn't bother preparing much. After all, what could an untrained single mom possibly do against him? For most of the day, it seemed like Hargrove's arrogance might pay off. He interrupted Rebecca every chance he got, objecting to her questions, dismissing her evidence, and generally making her look unprepared. The jury seemed sympathetic to Rebecca, but sympathy alone wouldn't win her case. She needed something big, something undeniable to tip the scales in her favor. That's when she noticed it, a subtle but telling detail in one of the documents Hargrove had submitted as evidence. It was a signed contract from the landlord, supposedly proving Rebecca had agreed to pay for the damages. But the signature wasn't hers. Rebecca's heart raced as she realized the implications. She quickly jotted down her observations and requested a brief recess. When the trial resumed, she came out swinging. First, she established her own credibility, walking the jury through her timeline of events with clear, concise statements. Then she dropped the bombshell, the landlord's forged signature. "Are you accusing my client of fraud?" Hargrove demanded, his voice rising. "I'm not accusing anyone," Rebecca replied calmly. "I'm letting the evidence speak for itself." The judge called for the contract to be examined by an independent expert. When the results came back confirming the forgery, the courtroom erupted in chaos. Now, as Rebecca stared down Hargrove in the packed courtroom, she felt a surge of pride. She'd come a long way from the overwhelmed mom sitting in her kitchen, wondering how she'd fight back. Hargrove, on the other hand, looked like a man who just realized he was standing on thin ice. Rebecca smiled. She wasn't done with him yet. The courtroom remained tense as Rebecca stood her ground. Her calm, deliberate demeanor was now the sharpest weapon in the room. Hargrove shuffled through his papers, his confidence evaporating as Rebecca presented another damning piece of evidence. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice steady but forceful, "this isn't just about the forged signature. The plaintiff's records show that they charged me for repairs to the apartment before I even signed a lease. And if you compare their maintenance logs to the payment invoices," Rebecca paused for effect, holding up two documents, "you'll see there's no match. The work they claim to have done, it never happened." The judge leaned forward, scrutinizing the papers Rebecca handed over. Meanwhile, Hargrove's usual charm had been replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. "Mr. Hargrove," the judge said, her tone growing stern, "do you have an explanation for these discrepancies?" Hargrove began, clearly flustered. "Your Honor, this is all irrelevant." The defendant is grasping at straws, trying to distract from the fact that she breached her lease agreement. Rebecca didn't flinch. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the only thing distracting from the facts is Mr. Hargrove's attempt to dismiss them. I've provided clear evidence that the landlord's claims are fabricated, and if we dig deeper, I believe we'll find more." The judge raised a hand, silencing the room. "I'll allow it. Miss Taylor, you may proceed." Rebecca nodded, heart racing but her face betraying none of her nerves. She took a deep breath and continued outlining the landlord's fraudulent practices, including suspiciously inflated repair costs and falsified inspection reports. She even revealed that one of the landlord's witnesses had a history of similar lawsuits in other states. Each revelation chipped away at Hargrove's credibility and the jury's confidence in his case. By the time Rebecca finished her presentation, the once-smug attorney looked like he was ready to disappear under the table. Months earlier, the idea of standing in a courtroom had seemed impossible for Rebecca. After filing her motion to delay the trial, she had scrambled to find more evidence while juggling her job at the diner and caring for Lily. There were nights when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. She'd sit at the kitchen table, stacks of legal documents in front of her, while Lily slept soundly in the next room. On one of those nights, she broke down, tears streaming down her face as the weight of it all crashed down on her. But then she thought of Lily, her bright, curious daughter who believed in her more than anyone else ever had. Rebecca wiped her tears and got back to work. She knew she needed help, but hiring a lawyer was out of the question. That's when she started reaching out to anyone who might lend her a hand. She found a retired paralegal who offered to review her research, a sympathetic journalist who shared tips on uncovering public records, and even a neighbor who helped with Lily so Rebecca could attend court filings and hearings. Little by little, Rebecca built her case. The final puzzle piece fell into place just 2 weeks before the trial when Rebecca received an anonymous tip. A former tenant of the same apartment complex sent her an email detailing similar issues with the landlord: bogus repair charges, missing documentation, and aggressive legal threats. The tenant included photos and receipts, all of which painted a damning picture of the landlord's unethical practices. Rebecca reached out to the tenant and convinced her to testify. It was a gamble. The landlord's attorney would undoubtedly try to discredit the witness, but Rebecca knew the risk was worth taking. Back in the courtroom, the tension was palpable as Rebecca called her final witness, the former tenant. The woman, a soft-spoken teacher named Carla, took the stand and described her experience in detail. She recounted how the landlord had charged her thousands of dollars for damages after she moved out, despite leaving the apartment in pristine condition. Hargrove tried to rattle her during cross-examination, but Carla held firm. "No, Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not mistaken. I kept every receipt, every email, and every photo. The landlord tried to intimidate me, but I wasn't going to let them win. And I'm glad I didn't. Rebecca watched as the jury absorbed Carla's testimony. She could see the doubt forming in their minds, the cracks in the landlord's story growing wider. But the real turning point came when Rebecca presented the anonymous tip. She handed the judge a folder containing documents from other former tenants, all of whom had experienced the same fraudulent behavior. "This isn't an isolated incident, Your Honor," Rebecca said. "It's a pattern. And it's time someone held the plaintiff accountable." The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the judge reviewed the documents. Hargrove, now visibly sweating, leaned over to whisper something to his client, who looked equally shaken. The judge's gavel struck the sound block. "Enough," she said, her tone commanding. "I will not tolerate any further attempts to mislead this court. Mr. Hargrove, your client has some serious explaining to do." Rebecca felt a surge of triumph, but she knew the battle wasn't over. The judge adjourned the proceedings for the day, allowing both sides to regroup. As Rebecca gathered her papers, she caught Hargrove's glare. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he hissed. Rebecca didn't hesitate. "I don't need to be clever, Mr. Hargrove. I just need the truth. And the truth is on my side." That night, Rebecca sat on her couch, staring at the folder of evidence she'd collected. She knew she'd scored a major victory, but she also knew Hargrove wouldn't go down without a fight. Lily climbed onto her lap, holding a picture she'd drawn. "Is that me?" Rebecca asked, pointing to the stick figure with a superhero cape. "No, Mommy," Lily said, grinning. "It's you. You're a hero." Rebecca hugged her daughter tightly, tears threatening to spill. "Not yet, sweetheart," she whispered. "But I'm getting there." The next morning, Rebecca arrived at the courthouse ready for whatever Hargrove had planned. But as she walked into the courtroom, she was greeted by a sight she hadn't expected. Hargrove, pacing nervously, his usual swagger replaced by a look of pure panic. Something had shifted, and Rebecca could feel it. And then it happened, a shocking twist that no one saw coming. Rebecca stepped into the courtroom, her confidence bolstered by the unease radiating from James Hargrove. He was pacing in front of the plaintiff's table, his hand clutching his phone so tightly it looked like he might crack the screen. His client, the landlord, was hunched over, whispering frantically. Rebecca took her seat, carefully arranging her documents as she tried to piece together what had changed. Had the judge uncovered something? Or had Hargrove's client made a mistake he couldn't cover up? The judge entered, calling the courtroom to order. Everyone rose, and Rebecca noticed how pale Hargrove looked. Something was definitely wrong. "Before we resume," the judge began, her tone clipped, "I've been made aware of new information that requires immediate attention." She glanced down at her notes, then fixed her gaze on Hargrove. "Mr. Hargrove, I've received a formal complaint regarding your client's recent actions. Would you care to explain this?" Hargrove froze, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words. "Your Honor," he stammered, I'm not sure what you're referring to." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Let me be clear. An independent party has submitted evidence suggesting your client attempted to intimidate witnesses outside this courtroom." Gasps rippled through the room. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. Intimidate witnesses? She hadn't expected this. "I object." Hargrove spluttered. "This is baseless." "Enough, Mr. Hargrove," the judge interrupted, her voice cutting through his protests. "I'm giving you one chance to address this accusation before I escalate the matter further." Rebecca leaned forward, her mind racing. If this accusation held water, it could be the break she needed. But who had submitted the complaint? "Your Honor," Hargrove began, his voice shaking slightly, "this is a clear attempt to derail the case. My client has done no such thing." The judge didn't look convinced. "We'll see about that. Bailiff, bring in the witness." All eyes turned toward the courtroom doors as they opened, revealing a man in a maintenance uniform. Rebecca recognized him immediately. It was Paul, the apartment complex's head janitor. Paul hesitated at the doorway, his eyes scanning the room nervously before landing on Rebecca. She gave him a reassuring nod. Slowly, he stepped forward and took the stand. "State your name for the record," the judge instructed. "Paul Martinez," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And your occupation?" "I'm the head of maintenance at the Lincoln Heights Apartments." "Mr. Martinez, can you confirm that you voluntarily submitted a complaint against the plaintiff in this case?" Paul nodded, his hands trembling slightly. Yes, Your Honor. And what does this complaint entail? Paul swallowed hard, glancing briefly at Hargrove and the landlord before speaking. Ah, I worked at Lincoln Heights for 8 years. I've seen a lot of things I wasn't proud of, but I stayed quiet because I needed the job. But this was too much. The judge leaned forward. Go on. Last week, the landlord called me into his office, Paul said, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. He told me to keep my mouth shut about the fake repair records. He said if I testified or gave anyone information, I'd lose my job and he'd make sure no one else would hire me. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Order, the judge called, banging her gavel. She turned back to Paul. Are you willing to provide evidence to support these claims? Paul nodded, pulling a small stack of papers from his pocket. I kept copies of the emails he sent me, and I recorded our conversation. Hargrove's face turned a deep shade of red. Your Honor, this is outrageous. My client has rights. Mr. Hargrove, sit down, the judge snapped. We'll review this evidence immediately. The bailiff collected Paul's papers and played the recording for the court. As the landlord's voice echoed through the room, threatening, mocking, and unmistakably guilty, the atmosphere grew heavy. Rebecca couldn't believe her ears. 2 weeks earlier, Rebecca had crossed paths with Paul purely by accident. She'd gone to the apartment complex to take pictures of the supposed damages listed in her lawsuit. While walking around, she'd noticed Paul fixing a broken light fixture in the hallway. Excuse me, she'd said, pulling out her phone to show him a photo. Do you know if this damage was ever repaired? It's listed in the lawsuit against me, but I don't think it was. Paul had glanced at the photo, then at her, his expression wary. You're the one suing Mr. Jacobs? Defending myself, she corrected. I don't have much of a choice. Paul hesitated, then lowered his voice. That damage? It's been there for years. No one's fixed it. Rebecca's pulse quickened. Are you serious? Would you be willing to testify? Paul had shaken his head quickly. I can't. I'd lose my job. She hadn't pressed him, but she'd left her number just in case. Now, seeing him on the stand, she realized how much courage it had taken for him to come forward. As the judge reviewed the evidence, the tension in the room was palpable. Rebecca could see the jury exchanging glances, their expressions a mix of anger and disbelief. Hargrove sat frozen, his client whispering furiously in his ear. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was calm but steely. Mr. Hargrove, this is a serious matter. Based on the evidence provided, I'm inclined to believe that your client engaged in witness intimidation. This court will not tolerate such behavior. The landlord's face turned ghostly white. I didn't. Silence, the judge barked. This trial is no longer just about unpaid damages. We're now looking at potential criminal charges. Rebecca's heart raced. The case had just taken a dramatic turn, and for the first time, it felt like the scales were tipping firmly in her favor. But as the judge announced a recess to allow further investigation, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that Hargrove had one last trick up his sleeve. She gathered her papers and glanced over at him. He was staring at her, his eyes cold and calculating. Rebecca knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. As Rebecca walked out of the courtroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The dramatic turn of events had shifted the trial in her favor, but the look in James Hargrove's eyes as he stared her down suggested he wasn't going to give up easily. She sat on a bench outside, taking a moment to catch her breath. The courthouse buzzed with activity around her, but she focused on steadying her thoughts. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she pulled it out to find a message from her neighbor, Susan. Lily's doing great. We just baked cookies. She says she can't wait to see her superhero mom. Smiling face with smiling eyes. Rebecca smiled, the weight on her chest lifting slightly. Lily was her anchor, the reason she was fighting so hard. She sent a quick reply thanking Susan and tucked the phone away. As she stood to head back into the courthouse, a man in a gray suit approached her. Ms. Taylor, he asked, his voice low and professional. Yes, she replied, eyeing him warily. My name is David Stern. I'm a reporter for the Boston Ledger. I was inside the courtroom earlier, and I have to say your performance was impressive. Rebecca stiffened. I'm not looking for publicity, Mr. Stern. David held up his hands. I understand. I'm not here to exploit your story. but I've been covering cases involving Mr. Hargrove and his clients for years, and let's just say this isn't the first time questionable tactics have come to light. Rebecca tilted her head. Questionable how? David leaned in slightly. Hargrove has a pattern of taking on clients with, let's call it creative bookkeeping. He's great at spinning half-truths into airtight cases, but every now and then, someone like you comes along and threatens to unravel the whole operation. Rebecca's pulse quickened. Are you saying this goes deeper than just my case? David nodded. Much deeper. I've been investigating some of his previous clients, and I've found evidence of fraudulent practices, shell companies, even tax evasion. If you're willing to talk, I think we can help each other. Rebecca hesitated. She didn't trust journalists, at least not easily, but something about David's earnest tone made her pause. I'll think about it, she said finally. But right now, I need to focus on the trial. David handed her a business card. Fair enough. If you change your mind, give me a call. Good luck in there, Ms. Taylor. Rebecca slipped the card into her pocket and returned to the courtroom. The recess was over, and it was time to face Hargrove again. Inside, the atmosphere was charged. The judge re-entered, and the trial resumed. Hargrove, now visibly calmer, stood to address the court. Your Honor, while we respect the seriousness of the allegations against my client, we believe this trial has become unnecessarily convoluted. To that end, we would like to file a motion to dismiss. Rebecca's jaw clenched. Of course, he was trying to escape the consequences. The judge frowned. On what grounds, Mr. Hargrove? Hargrove adjusted his tie, his smirk returning. On the grounds that the defendant's accusations are based on circumstantial evidence and unverified testimony. My client has consistently maintained his innocence, and this courtroom should not be used as a platform for baseless attacks. Rebecca shot to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. The evidence we presented is neither circumstantial nor unverified. The emails, the recordings, the witness testimony, they all point to a clear pattern of misconduct. The judge held up a hand, signaling for silence. Mr. Hargrove, your motion to dismiss is denied. We will proceed. Rebecca let out a small sigh of relief, but Hargrove wasn't finished. He turned to his client, whispering something that made the landlord nod. Then he stood again. In that case, Your Honor, we would like to call a surprise witness to the stand. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Rebecca's stomach sank. A surprise witness? She hadn't prepared for this. The judge raised an eyebrow. A surprise witness, Mr. Hargrove? You're aware that introducing new witnesses at this stage requires prior notice. Hargrove nodded. I understand, Your Honor, but this witness only came forward during the recess. Their testimony is critical to our case. The judge sighed. Very well. Call your witness. Rebecca watched as the courtroom doors opened, and a woman stepped inside. She was tall, with sharp features and a confident stride. Rebecca didn't recognize her, but the way she avoided eye contact made Rebecca's chest tighten. State your name for the record, Hargrove said. Emily Carter, the woman replied, her voice steady. And your occupation? I'm an accountant, Emily said. Specifically, I manage the financial records for Lincoln Heights Apartments. Rebecca's heart sank. An accountant? Hargrove had brought in someone with intimate knowledge of the landlord's finances, a witness who could potentially discredit her entire case. Hargrove wasted no time launching into his questions. Emily testified that the landlord's financial records were meticulously kept and that there was no evidence of fraud or forgery in their dealings. Ms. Carter, Hargrove said, his tone dripping with confidence, based on your professional experience, would you say the allegations against my client are baseless? Yes, Emily replied without hesitation. The defendant's claims are not supported by the financial records I've reviewed. Rebecca's mind raced. She needed to poke holes in Emily's testimony, but how? The woman was confident, polished, and clearly coached by Hargrove. When it was Rebecca's turn to cross-examine, she stood slowly, her expression calm despite the storm raging inside her. Ms. Carter, she began, how long have you worked for Lincoln Heights Apartments? 3 years, Emily replied. And in that time, have you ever come across discrepancies in the financial records? Emily hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but Rebecca caught it. No, Emily said, her voice firm. The records are accurate. Rebecca stepped closer, her gaze narrowing. You're sure about that? Yes. Rebecca paused. letting the silence hang in the air. Then she took a risk. Ms. Carter, are you aware of the IRS investigation currently being conducted into your client's financial practices? The courtroom erupted into gasps. Hargrove jumped to his feet. Objection. This is speculative. Overruled, the judge said, her eyes narrowing at Hargrove. Answer the question, Ms. Carter. Emily's face turned pale. I don't know anything about that. Rebecca smiled inwardly. She'd hit a nerve. Interesting, Rebecca said. Because according to these documents, she held up a folder. Your client failed to report income from multiple tenants over the past 2 years. If that's not a discrepancy, then what is? Emily's composure cracked. She stammered, unable to form a coherent response. Hargrove's smug expression vanished, replaced by thinly veiled panic. As the judge called for another recess, Rebecca sat down, her heart pounding. She'd landed a critical blow, but she knew Hargrove wouldn't go down without a fight. And sure enough, as the courtroom emptied, Hargrove shot her a look that sent a chill down her spine. Whatever he was planning next, it was going to be big. Rebecca sat at the defendant's table during the recess, flipping through her notes, but her mind kept replaying the look Hargrove had given her. It wasn't just anger or frustration, it was something darker. He was planning something, and she needed to be ready. The courthouse cafeteria was crowded, but Rebecca found a corner table where she could sit quietly and strategize. Her confidence had grown after she'd rattled Emily Carter on the stand, but she knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Hargrove was too cunning, and his client too desperate to go down easily. As she sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed with a text from David Stern, the journalist she'd met earlier. Got a lead on Hargrove's next move. Call me when you're free. Rebecca hesitated. Could she trust him? On the other hand, ignoring a potential lead could be risky. She stepped outside into the cold air, dialing his number. Rebecca, David answered on the first ring. Glad you called. What's this about a lead? She asked, cutting to the chase. I spoke to one of Hargrove's former clients, David said. Apparently, when he feels cornered, he has a habit of fabricating last-minute evidence to discredit his opponents. It's dirty, but it's worked for him in the past. Rebecca clenched her jaw. Do you think he's going to try that with me? I bet on it, David replied. I've got a source digging into his past cases. If there's a pattern, we'll find it. In the meantime, watch your back. Hargrove doesn't like losing. Rebecca thanked him and hung up, her mind racing. She needed to anticipate his next move. If he was planning to introduce fake evidence, she'd have to be ready to dismantle it. Back in the courtroom, the tension was thicker than ever. Hargrove and his client sat huddled together, whispering frantically. Rebecca couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told her everything she needed to know. They were plotting something. The judge returned, and the trial resumed. Rebecca's pulse quickened as Hargrove stood to address the court. Your Honor, he began, his tone carefully measured, we have uncovered new evidence that we believe is critical to this case. Rebecca's stomach dropped. Here it comes. The judge frowned. New evidence. Mr. Hargrove, you are aware that introducing evidence at this stage requires the court's approval. I understand, Your Honor, Hargrove said smoothly. However, this evidence was only recently brought to our attention. It directly contradicts the defendant's claims and proves that she has been less than truthful in her testimony. Rebecca stood immediately. Objection, Your Honor. This is a blatant attempt to derail the trial. Mr. Hargrove has had ample time to present his evidence, and introducing it now is highly suspect. The judge looked between them, her expression stern. Mr. Hargrove, you'd better have a compelling reason for this last-minute submission. Hargrove handed a folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Rebecca watched as the judge opened it, her face unreadable as she scanned the contents. These are financial statements, the judge said after a moment, allegedly showing that the defendant accepted a cash settlement from the plaintiff before this trial began. Care to explain, Ms. Taylor? Rebecca's heart sank. Your Honor, I've never accepted a settlement. Those documents are fake. Hargrove stepped forward, his expression oozing fake sincerity. With all due respect, Ms. Taylor, these documents are certified copies of bank transactions. They clearly show a payment from my client to your account. That's a lie. Rebecca snapped, her voice rising. I've never received any money from them. The judge raised a hand. Enough. I'll have these documents examined by a forensic expert. Until then, we'll proceed cautiously. Rebecca sat down, her mind spinning. If those documents were allowed into evidence, they could destroy her case. She had to act fast. That night, Rebecca stayed up late reviewing her own bank statements. She needed to prove that the alleged transaction never happened. But as she combed through the records, she felt a sinking dread. Hargrove wasn't just fabricating evidence, he was doing it in a way that would be hard to refute. Her phone buzzed. It was David Stern again. "Tell me you've got good news," she said, answering quickly. "I might," David replied. "Remember I told you I was digging into Hargrove's past cases? Well, I found something interesting. A few years ago, he pulled the same stunt, introduced fake financial records at the 11th hour to discredit his opponent. But here's the kicker. He used the same document forger in all those cases." Rebecca's eyes widened. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. I'm emailing you the details now. If you can link that forger to your case, it could blow Hargrove's whole strategy apart." Rebecca thanked him and hung up, quickly opening her laptop. The email contained everything she needed: the forger's name, their history of creating fake documents, and even a few cases where their work had been exposed. She stayed up the rest of the night preparing. By morning, she had a plan. The next day in court, Rebecca stood with a newfound confidence. When the judge asked if she had any response to the alleged financial records, she didn't hesitate. "Your Honor, these documents are not only false, they're part of a pattern," she said. "I have evidence linking Mr. Hargrove's office to a known document forger who has fabricated similar records in past cases." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Hargrove's face turned an alarming shade of red. The judge banged her gavel. "Order. Miss Taylor, if what you're saying is true, this is a serious accusation. Do you have proof?" "Yes, Your Honor," Rebecca replied, handing over the evidence she'd gathered. "These are court records from previous cases where this forger's work was exposed. The same methods used in those cases match the methods used to create these documents." The judge reviewed the evidence carefully. Her expression hardened as she looked up at Hargrove. "Mr. Hargrove, do you have an explanation for this?" Hargrove stammered, his usual composure unraveling. "Your Honor, I wasn't aware of any forgery." "That's enough," the judge said sharply. "This court does not tolerate dishonesty, especially not from officers of the court. We will recess until I've reviewed this matter further." Rebecca sat down, her hand shaking slightly. She'd struck a major blow, but she knew the battle wasn't over yet. Hargrove was down, but he wasn't out. As she gathered her papers, she noticed Hargrove glaring at her again. This time his expression wasn't just angry, it was vengeful. Whatever came next, Rebecca knew it would be his most desperate move yet. The tension in the courtroom had shifted entirely. Rebecca's evidence linking Hargrove to the forger had left him visibly shaken, his confidence unraveling in front of everyone. But Rebecca knew better than to relax. The way he had glared at her as court recessed sent chills through her spine. Desperate men were dangerous, and Hargrove was no exception. Back at home that evening, Rebecca put Lily to bed and sat down with her laptop. Her kitchen table had become her war room, covered in notes, documents, and her neatly organized legal research. Despite her exhaustion, she couldn't afford to let her guard down. She had to be ready for whatever Hargrove tried next. Her phone buzzed with a new email. It was from David Stern. "Thought you might find this interesting," the message read, followed by a link. Rebecca clicked it and was taken to a news article about another case Hargrove had handled years earlier. It detailed a similar situation, Hargrove introducing questionable evidence to sway a jury and intimidate his opponent. In that case, the opposing lawyer had successfully discredited him, and his client had been hit with severe penalties. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Hargrove had a playbook, and she was starting to see the pattern. If he followed the same strategy, he would try to overwhelm her with more fake evidence, hoping to create enough doubt to distract the court from the truth. She needed to stay 2 steps ahead. The next morning, Rebecca arrived at the courthouse early. She wasn't surprised to find Hargrove and his client already there, sitting in a corner and whispering furiously. She caught bits of their conversation as she walked past. "Make sure the timing lines up. We can't afford any mistakes this time." Rebecca's stomach churned. She didn't have time to dwell on their scheming, though. The trial was about to resume, and she needed to stay focused. When court was called to order, Hargrove stood immediately. Your Honor, I'd like to present additional evidence to address the allegations raised by the defendant yesterday. Rebecca shot to her feet. Objection. This is another last-minute attempt to derail the trial. Mr. Hargrove is abusing the court's patience. The judge frowned. Mr. Hargrove, I hope you're not wasting this court's time with more questionable submissions. Not at all, Your Honor, Hargrove replied, his tone syrupy. This evidence will prove conclusively that my client has acted in good faith and that the defendant's accusations are entirely baseless. The judge sighed. Proceed, but I warn you, Mr. Hargrove, my tolerance is wearing thin. Hargrove handed a stack of documents to the bailiff, who delivered them to the judge. Rebecca's heart pounded as she watched the judge skim through the papers. These appear to be communications between the defendant and the plaintiff, the judge said, glancing at Rebecca. Care to explain, Ms. Taylor? Rebecca stepped forward, her voice steady. Your Honor, I've never seen those emails before. I can say with certainty that I never sent or received them. Hargrove smirked. Is that so? Because these emails were recovered from the defendant's email account and clearly show her agreeing to a settlement with my client. Rebecca's heart sank. She knew they were fake, but proving that would take time she might not have. Your Honor, she said, if those emails were truly from my account, they would be accessible through my own records. I request time to have them independently verified. The judge nodded. That's a reasonable request. Mr. Hargrove, I trust you won't object to this evidence being examined. Of course not, Your Honor, Hargrove said smoothly, though Rebecca caught the slight twitch in his jaw. The judge turned to Rebecca. I'll grant a brief delay for this verification process. Be prepared to present your findings promptly. Rebecca left the courtroom, determined to prove the emails were fraudulent. She contacted David Stern, explaining the situation. Let me make a few calls, he said. I know a cybersecurity expert who can help. Hours later, Rebecca was sitting across from a man named Chris, a soft-spoken but confident technician. He reviewed the emails Hargrove had submitted, frowning as he worked. These are sloppy, he muttered. It's clear they've been fabricated. Look here, the timestamps don't align with standard server logs, and the email headers show they were sent through a private proxy, not the defendant's actual account. Can you put that in a report? Rebecca asked. Already on it, Chris replied, typing quickly. If this goes to court, I'll testify. Rebecca thanked him, feeling a flicker of hope. With Chris's findings, she could expose Hargrove's latest scheme and strengthen her case even further. The next day in court, Rebecca stood tall as she presented Chris's report to the judge. Your Honor, she said, this report proves that the emails submitted by the plaintiff are fraudulent. The cybersecurity expert who examined them is prepared to testify. The judge reviewed the report, her expression hardening as she read. Mr. Hargrove, would you care to explain how your client obtained these fraudulent emails? Hargrove opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His client shifted uncomfortably, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Your Honor, Rebecca continued, this is yet another example of the plaintiff's willingness to lie and manipulate the court. At this point, it's clear that their case is built on nothing but dishonesty. The judge nodded slowly. I'm inclined to agree. Mr. Hargrove, unless you have a compelling explanation, I will consider sanctions for submitting falsified evidence. Hargrove's face turned ashen. His client leaned in to whisper something, but the damage was already done. The jury's expressions made it clear that they were losing any sympathy they might have had for the plaintiff. As the trial adjourned for the day, Rebecca felt a surge of triumph. She had turned the tide once again, exposing Hargrove's deceit for all to see. But as she packed up her papers, she noticed him watching her from across the room, his eyes dark with fury. You think this is over? He hissed as he passed her on his way out. You have no idea what's coming. Rebecca's stomach tightened. She knew Hargrove was cornered, and cornered animals always fought the hardest. Whatever he was planning next, it would be his most dangerous move yet. The courtroom doors closed behind Hargrove, leaving Rebecca standing still for a moment, trying to process his words. You have no idea what's coming. His tone wasn't just angry, it was threatening. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but forced herself to push it aside. Hargrove was bluffing. He had to be. That evening, Rebecca returned home to Lily, who greeted her at the door with a beaming smile and a drawing of a superhero. It was a simple but grounding moment that reminded Rebecca of her purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for their future. "Mommy, did you win today?" Lily asked, looking up at her with wide, innocent eyes. Rebecca knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's face. "I did, sweetheart. But it's not over yet. You'll win the next time, too," Lily said with a confidence only a child could muster. "You're the bravest person in the world." Rebecca hugged her tightly, drawing strength from her daughter's unwavering belief in her. The next morning, Rebecca's phone buzzed with an email from David Stern. The subject line read, "Urgent, you need to see this." She opened it quickly, finding a link to a news story about another case Hargrove was handling. The article detailed accusations of witness tampering and evidence fabrication, eerily similar to what Rebecca was experiencing. David had attached a note, "Looks like Hargrove has a pattern. Let's talk before court." Rebecca agreed to meet him at a cafe near the courthouse. Over coffee, David explained what he'd uncovered. "This isn't just about your case," he said. "Hargrove's entire career is built on bending the rules, and his clients are usually in on it. But you're the first person who's come this close to exposing him." Rebecca frowned. "So what's his next move?" David leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Hargrove doesn't play fair. He'll try to find a weakness, something he can use to discredit you or distract the court. Be prepared for anything." Rebecca nodded, her mind racing. She thanked David and left the cafe, determined to stay one step ahead. When court resumed, the tension was palpable. Hargrove's smug demeanor had returned, but Rebecca noticed something different in his body language. He wasn't just confident, he was plotting something. "Your Honor," Hargrove began, standing with a practiced air of control, "before we proceed, I must address a matter of great importance regarding the defendant's credibility." Rebecca's heart sank. She braced herself as Hargrove pulled out a folder and handed it to the bailiff. "These documents," he said, "reveal that Ms. Taylor has a history of financial instability and legal troubles, which raise serious questions about her integrity." Rebecca stood immediately. "Objection. This is irrelevant to the case and a blatant attempt to smear my character." The judge frowned. "Mr. Hargrove, unless this is directly related to the case, I suggest you tread carefully." "Your Honor," Hargrove continued, his tone dripping with false concern, "this is directly relevant. It shows that the defendant has a pattern of financial irresponsibility, which undermines her claims against my client." The judge reviewed the documents, her expression hard to read. "Miss Taylor, do you wish to respond?" Rebecca nodded, standing tall. "Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt to shift focus away from the plaintiff's misconduct. My personal financial history has no bearing on the fraudulent actions of the plaintiff, and introducing this information is nothing more than a distraction." The judge appeared thoughtful for a moment before turning back to Hargrove. "I'll allow the documents to be entered into the record, but only as context. They will not serve as evidence against the defendant's claims." Rebecca let out a small sigh of relief, but she knew Hargrove wasn't done yet. As the trial proceeded, Hargrove began a line of questioning designed to paint Rebecca as reckless and unreliable. He brought up missed rent payments, late utility bills, and other struggles she'd faced as a single mother. Rebecca answered calmly, refusing to let him rattle her. "You seem to have a habit of ignoring financial obligations, Miss Taylor," Hargrove said with a smirk. "Would you say this is a reflection of your overall character?" Rebecca met his gaze, her voice steady. "I would say it's a reflection of what happens when someone works 2 jobs to support their child while being taken advantage of by a dishonest landlord." A few members of the jury nodded subtly, and Hargrove's smirk faltered. Rebecca's composure held strong until the final recess of the day. As she gathered her papers, a man approached her, someone she didn't recognize. He was tall and burly, wearing a leather jacket and sunglasses. "Miss Taylor," he said in a low voice. Rebecca tensed. "Yes." The man leaned in slightly. A word of advice dropped the case. "It's not worth it." Her heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Who sent you?" The man didn't answer. He slipped a folded piece of paper into her hand and walked away without another word. Rebecca unfolded the paper, her hands trembling. It was a simple message written in block letters. "You're making a big mistake. Stop now before it's too late." Her stomach turned. This wasn't just about intimidation, it was a threat. She glanced around, but the man had disappeared into the crowd. That night, Rebecca sat at her kitchen table, the note in front of her. She debated calling the police but decided against it for now. She didn't want to escalate the situation unless it became unavoidable. Instead, she took a photo of the note and sent it to David Stern with a message, "Hargrove's pulling out all the stops. Got this after court." David replied almost immediately, "This proves they're scared. Don't let them shake you. We'll expose them." Rebecca hoped he was right, but as she looked at Lily sleeping peacefully in her bed, she felt a gnawing sense of dread. Hargrove was running out of options, and a cornered man with his reputation on the line was capable of anything. She knew the next day in court would bring the fight to a new level, and this time the stakes would be higher than ever. Rebecca barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the message scrawled on the note, "You're making a big mistake. Stop now before it's too late." She spent hours going over her case again, ensuring there were no weak spots Hargrove could exploit. By the time her alarm buzzed at dawn, she was running on sheer determination. She dressed in her most professional outfit, gave Lily a tight hug, and whispered promises of victory. Then she dropped her off at Susan's house before heading to the courthouse. As she walked up the courthouse steps, her phone buzzed with a call from David Stern. "Morning," she said, her voice tinged with fatigue. "Morning. Listen, I looked into that note you got," David said. The handwriting matches threats sent to another client who went up against Hargrove. It's his style, intimidate and rattle his opponent. "Well, it didn't work," Rebecca replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. "I'm not backing down." "Good," David said, "because I've got more dirt on Hargrove. He's involved in a whole web of shady dealings, including paying off witnesses. I've sent you everything I have. Use it wisely." Rebecca thanked him and hung up, opening the email on her phone. It was a goldmine. Hargrove's connections to underhanded schemes were laid out in detail, complete with witness statements and legal documents. She forwarded it to her printer at home, determined to bring it into court if the opportunity arose. The trial resumed, and the atmosphere was heavier than ever. Rebecca could feel the weight of the jury's eyes on her. Hargrove, as expected, wore his usual smug grin, but there was a nervous energy beneath it. He knew he was on the ropes, and he wasn't going down without a fight. "Your Honor," Hargrove began, standing dramatically, "before we proceed, I would like to call another witness to the stand." Rebecca stiffened. Another surprise witness? She braced herself as the courtroom doors opened, and a man walked in. He was older, with a weathered face and a stiff posture. Rebecca didn't recognize him, but the landlord's satisfied smirk made her stomach drop. "State your name for the record," Hargrove said. "James Reynolds," the man replied. "And your relationship to this case?" "I was hired to repair damages at Lincoln Heights Apartments," Reynolds said. "Specifically, I worked on the damages caused by Ms. Taylor during her tenancy." Rebecca stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This witness was not disclosed, and his testimony cannot be verified without prior notice." Hargrove turned, his smirk firmly in place. "Your Honor, Mr. Reynolds' testimony is crucial. It directly confirms the validity of my client's claims." The judge frowned but allowed the testimony. Rebecca clenched her fists, determined to find a way to counter whatever lies this man had been coached to tell. Hargrove wasted no time leading Reynolds through his testimony. The man claimed to have personally repaired thousands of dollars worth of damages in Rebecca's apartment, listing broken fixtures, ruined flooring, and vandalized walls. "And you're certain these damages were caused by Ms. Taylor?" Hargrove asked. "Yes," Reynolds replied confidently. "The timeline matches perfectly." Rebecca's mind raced. This wasn't just fabricated, it was brazenly false. She'd left her apartment in pristine condition when she moved out, and she had the photos to prove it. When it was her turn to cross-examine, Rebecca approached the witness stand with measured calm. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, "how long have you worked as a repair contractor?" "Over 30 years, he replied. "And how were you contacted for this specific job?" "The landlord called me directly," Reynolds said. Rebecca tilted her head. "Do you keep records of your repairs? Invoices, receipts, things like that?" "Of course. Do you have those records with you today?" Reynolds hesitated, glancing at Hargrove. "No, I wasn't asked to bring them." "How convenient," Rebecca said, her voice dripping with polite sarcasm. "You've been a contractor for 30 years. Surely you understand the importance of documentation, especially in legal matters." The man shifted uncomfortably. "I wasn't told it was necessary." Rebecca smiled faintly. No further questions, Your Honor. During the next recess, Rebecca returned to her table and pulled up the evidence David had sent her. Among the documents was a statement from a former employee of Hargrove's office who had exposed a pattern of using false witnesses. Rebecca's pulse quickened. If she could link Reynolds to Hargrove's schemes, she could discredit his testimony entirely. The trial resumed, and Rebecca stood to address the court. Your Honor, I have new evidence that calls into question the credibility of the plaintiff's witness, she said, holding up the document. This statement, from a former employee of Mr. Hargrove's office, outlines a history of using false witnesses in similar cases. I request permission to introduce it into the record. The judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Hargrove, do you wish to respond? Hargrove stood, his face a mask of forced calm. Your Honor, this is a baseless accusation with no relevance to this case. Rebecca pressed on. The witness, Mr. Reynolds, claimed to have repaired damages in my apartment, yet he provided no documentation to support his testimony. This pattern aligns with the statement I've submitted. The judge reviewed the statement, her expression growing more severe by the second. Mr. Reynolds, she said, turning to the witness, do you have any documentation to corroborate your testimony? Reynolds fumbled for words. I don't. That's enough, the judge said sharply. Mr. Hargrove, this court is growing tired of these antics. If your next move is anything less than entirely legitimate, I will have no choice but to consider sanctions. Rebecca's heart soared as the judge dismissed Reynolds' testimony, but the victory was short-lived. As the trial adjourned for the day, Hargrove approached her in the hallway. You're clever, he said, his voice low and venomous. But clever doesn't win wars. You should have walked away while you had the chance. Rebecca met his glare with unwavering resolve. And you should have played fair. But it's too late for that now. Hargrove's lips twisted into a sneer. This isn't over. Rebecca watched him storm off, her nerves on edge. He was losing control, and that made him more dangerous than ever. She knew the next day would bring another escalation, and she had to be ready for whatever came next. The courtroom was buzzing with tension as the trial entered its final days. Rebecca had managed to dismantle Hargrove's fabricated evidence and discredit his surprise witnesses, but she knew the fight wasn't over. Hargrove was desperate, and desperate men were unpredictable. Rebecca sat at her table, going over her notes one last time before the session began. She had a plan, but it hinged on timing and precision. Across the room, Hargrove was whispering furiously to his client, who looked increasingly anxious. When the judge entered and the trial resumed, Hargrove rose to address the court with an air of forced calm. Your Honor, the plaintiff has one final piece of evidence that we believe will conclusively prove our case, he said, handing a thick envelope to the bailiff. Rebecca's chest tightened. What now? The judge opened the envelope and examined its contents. Her eyebrows furrowed, and she glanced at Rebecca. Ms. Taylor, these appear to be photographs of the alleged damages to your former apartment. Do you have anything to say about this? Rebecca stood, her voice steady. Yes, Your Honor. I've seen similar tactics from the plaintiff before, and I believe these photographs are fabricated. I request time to examine them. The judge nodded. Granted. We'll reconvene after a brief recess. During the recess, Rebecca pored over the photos. At first glance, they seemed damning, shattered windows, holes in walls, and water-damaged floors. But as she examined them more closely, something caught her eye, a timestamp in the corner of one photo. Gotcha, she whispered, a smile tugging at her lips. The timestamp indicated that the photo had been taken 3 months after Rebecca moved out. It wasn't just a minor inconsistency, it was proof that the photos couldn't possibly be tied to her tenancy. She quickly documented her findings and prepared her counterargument. When court reconvened, Rebecca stood confidently. Your Honor, she began, the photographs submitted by the plaintiff are not only irrelevant, they're fraudulent. The timestamps clearly show that these images were taken months after I vacated the property. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Rebecca handed copies of her analysis to the judge and jury. Hargrove's client buried his face in his hands, while Hargrove's jaw tightened. Mr. Hargrove, the judge said, her voice icy. Do you have an explanation for this? Hargrove stammered. Your Honor, there must have been a mix-up. A mix-up, the judge interrupted. This court has tolerated your tactics long enough. Submitting fraudulent evidence is a serious offense, and I will not allow it to go unpunished. Rebecca felt a surge of relief as the judge's words hit Hargrove like a hammer. But she knew he wouldn't give up without one last attempt to save himself. As the trial reached its climax, Hargrove called his client to the stand. The landlord, clearly nervous, tried to stick to the script, but Rebecca's cross-examination quickly unraveled his story. "Mr. Jacobs," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you've claimed that I caused extensive damages to the apartment. Yet you've provided no credible documentation to support these claims. Why is that?" The landlord shifted uncomfortably. I didn't think I needed to." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "You didn't think you needed documentation for thousands of dollars in alleged damages? Well, and what about the invoices you claimed to have for the repairs? Where are those?" I don't have them," Jacobs admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca turned to the jury. "The plaintiff has no invoices, no credible photographs, and no legitimate testimony. This case is built on lies, and the evidence speaks for itself." By the time closing arguments began, the mood in the courtroom had shifted entirely. Rebecca laid out her case with clarity and conviction, pointing out every inconsistency and fabrication in the plaintiff's claims. The jury listened intently, their expressions a mix of anger and disbelief at the landlord's audacity. Hargrove's closing argument, on the other hand, was a desperate attempt to salvage what little credibility his case had left. He tried to paint Rebecca as a struggling single mother who was using the legal system to avoid her responsibilities, but the jury wasn't buying it. When the jury retired to deliberate, Rebecca sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The hours felt like an eternity, but finally, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The judge called the court to order, and the foreperson of the jury stood to deliver their decision. In the case of Jacobs versus Taylor, we find in favor of the defendant. The courtroom erupted in whispers and murmurs. Rebecca felt a wave of relief wash over her as the judge dismissed the case. She had done it. She had won. As Rebecca gathered her things, Hargrove stormed out of the courtroom without a word. His client followed close behind, his face pale and defeated. David Stern caught up with Rebecca outside the courthouse. "You were incredible in there," he said, broad smile on his face. "Thanks," Rebecca said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "But I couldn't have done it without your help." David handed her a folder. "Speaking of help, here's everything we've got on Hargrove. You're not the only one he's tried to bully, and I think it's time someone held him accountable." Rebecca nodded. "Let's make sure he never does this to anyone else." That evening, Rebecca returned home to Lily, who ran into her arms with a squeal of delight. "Did you win, Mommy?" Lily asked. Rebecca smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. We won." Lily grinned. "I knew you would. You're my hero." Rebecca hugged her tightly, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in months. The fight was over, but the lessons she had learned and the strength she had discovered within herself would stay with her forever. But even as she celebrated her victory, she couldn't shake the feeling that her battle with Hargrove wasn't entirely over. If there was one thing she'd learned, it was that people like him didn't give up easily. And if he came for her again, she would be ready. Rebecca thought the courtroom victory would be the end of her fight. For days, she enjoyed a sense of relief she hadn't felt in months. She spent her time catching up on moments with Lily, baking cookies, playing games, and simply enjoying the peace of not having to prepare for another court battle. But she couldn't shake the sense of unfinished business. The folder David Stern had given her weighed heavily on her mind. Inside it were not just details of Hargrove's misconduct in her case, but evidence tying him to a string of fraudulent lawsuits, false witnesses, and shady dealings. As much as Rebecca wanted to move on, she knew she couldn't let Hargrove continue to ruin other lives. Her victory wouldn't mean anything if she allowed him to prey on someone else. A week after the trial, Rebecca and David met with a federal prosecutor to hand over the folder. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Claire Andrews, listened intently as Rebecca and David detailed everything they knew. "This is damning evidence," Claire said, flipping through the documents. "If half of this checks out, Hargrove could lose his license and face serious jail time." Rebecca nodded. "I want to make sure he can't do this to anyone else." Claire smiled faintly. "With this evidence and your testimony, we can build a solid case. Are you ready for that?" Rebecca hesitated for a moment. She had fought so hard just to protect herself and Lily. Did she have the strength to face another legal battle, this time as a key witness. Then she thought about all the people Hargrove had hurt, people who hadn't been as lucky as she was. She thought about Lily and the kind of example she wanted to set for her daughter. Yes, Rebecca said firmly. I'm ready. The investigation into Hargrove gained momentum quickly. With Rebecca's cooperation, Claire and her team uncovered a mountain of evidence, including records of bribes, fabricated evidence, and even threats to witnesses. Other victims came forward, emboldened by Rebecca's story. Each new account painted a clearer picture of a man who had built his career on lies and intimidation. News outlets began covering the story, with headlines like "High-profile lawyer faces fraud allegations" and "James Hargrove's web of deceit unraveled." The once untouchable attorney was now the center of a media storm, his reputation in tatters. Hargrove's downfall came swiftly. The prosecutor's office charged him with multiple counts of fraud, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice. Rebecca testified at his trial, recounting everything she had endured during her case. Her calm, honest demeanor contrasted sharply with Hargrove's blustering attempts to defend himself. The jury deliberated for less than a day before finding him guilty on all counts. As the judge handed down a lengthy prison sentence, Rebecca felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had not only won her own case, but also ensured that Hargrove could no longer hurt anyone else. Months later, Rebecca stood in the kitchen with Lily, preparing dinner. The smell of spaghetti sauce filled the air, and Lily chattered about her day at school. "Mommy," Lily said suddenly, "do you think the bad man will ever come back?" Rebecca knelt to look her daughter in the eye. "No, sweetheart. He won't. And if anyone ever tries to hurt us again, I'll be ready. Just like I was before." Lily nodded solemnly, then broke into a smile. "Because you're the strongest, bravest mommy in the world." Rebecca laughed, pulling Lily into a hug. "And you're the strongest, bravest little girl." That night, as Rebecca tucked Lily into bed, she reflected on how far they had come. The road had been long and difficult, but it had taught her the power of resilience, determination, and standing up for what was right. She had turned her fear into courage and her struggle into a victory not just for herself, but for others. Rebecca didn't know what challenges the future might hold, but she was no longer afraid. She had faced the worst and come out stronger. No matter what lay ahead, she knew she could handle it. As she turned off Lily's light and closed the door, a sense of peace settled over her. This chapter of their lives was over, and a brighter, freer one was just beginning.